To our NEEP Ready, Set, Scale webinar. I think for now, I'll kick us off right now because we have some logistics to go through, but we'll get into the content once everyone gets here. So yes, today we will be talking about setting the table for building decarbonization. And my name is Erin Cosgrove. I'm Senior Manager of the Policy and Programs team here at NEEP. Off to the next slide. Just a couple things to note as we get started on this webinar. First is the webinar is being recorded. Also, if you're interested, we have closed captioning available. The webinar recordings will all be sent to those that are registered, and the slides will be available. And we will be keeping all on mute as we go through the webinar. But chat is available for people to discuss anything that comes up that you would like to talk about, collaborate, or make comments. And we also have a Q&A feature. So at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for some panel discussion. And please float the questions that you'd like to hear our panelists answer into that Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to bring it up again at the end. Next slide, please. Great. So first, before we get started, a little background on the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, or NEEP as we call it. NEEP is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization founded in 1996. We're one of 6 RIOs that actually operate throughout the United States to help states implement energy efficiency policies. And we like to drive market transformation regionally by fostering collaboration, innovation, and developing research tools and disseminating knowledge, such as through these webinars that we're doing today. Next slide. And great, I'd like to just very quickly thank our foundation and federal funders, as well as our state energy offices and allies that will be coming through on the next few slides. Great. And with that, we will now dive into our discussion, which is setting the table for building decarbonization. And if you hop to the next slide, we have an agenda for today that I'll walk everyone through. So I'll kick us off introducing what setting the table for building decarbonization means, why we want to talk about a table instead of one single policy. We'll then pass it off to Nancy Seidman from the Regulatory Assistance Project to talk about emission equipment standards. Then Richard Cowart will join us to talk about clean heat standards. And then we'll be joined by 2 states, Massachusetts with Emily Lamb and Will Space, and Mark Stewart from the Department of Maryland to talk about how those states are implementing these policies and building their building decarbonization table, or setting their building decarbonization table. And then we'll definitely leave some time at the end for audience Q&A and discussion. So please, again, feel free to take advantage of the Q&A function and pop any questions you have for us in the chat. Next slide, please. Great. So to kick off the webinar today, I wanted to introduce a report that NEEP wrote alongside with the Regulatory Assistance Project and NESCOM, which is Decarbonizing Buildings, How States Can Set the Table for Success. And this report provides 4 legs that states can look at to create comprehensive building decarbonization policy. And before we get into the meat of the report, I actually wanted to invite Brianna from NESCOM to come on and kind of talk a little bit about NESCOM's role in this space and that organization.
Yes, hi, I'm Rihanna Harker from NESCOM, and we are essentially the NEEP equivalent for Northeast environmental agencies, and we specifically work with air and climate offices. Our building electrification initiative works on accelerating the transition to zero-emission buildings and directly convenes states to exchange information on related policies. So if you are not part of our task force and want to be, please feel free to contact me. And so for us, developing this report is part of our larger effort to provide a roadmap for states and general support to help reduce building emissions to zero. And I can give it back to Erin.
Great, thank you so much. And we will shortly hear from the Regulatory Assistance Project, who also played a key role in this report as well. But with that, I'll dive into why we created the report in the first place. So next slide, please. So we know that building decarbonization requires a lot of policies and a lot of actions happening at once. Currently, states are trying to identify one key policy, but there's limitations when it's done one at a time and uncoordinated. We see insufficient and unpredictable funding. There's kind of a lack of central coordination. And we also need comprehensive policies to address the housing inequities and other discriminatory practices in our energy and housing systems that we'd like to overcome. So we saw that there really is no one policy to mandate or encourage building decarbonization, but states need to enact a suite of coordinated policies in order to drive this market transformation. Next slide, please. And so we've created a table that states can look to set in order to unlock building decarbonization efforts. And we created this table because it actually hits on key market actors in the regulatory policy and in the market itself throughout building that need to change actions or uh, change how they're shifting things in order to accomplish building decarbonization. But we've identified 4 areas of actions for states to take within the report. And I'll go through them quickly here, but I encourage everyone to download the report and learn a little bit more about what these key actions are. So the legs of the table are equity and workforce, which address housing and workforce inequities. Carbon reduction obligations, what sets performance requirements for obligated parties, such as energy providers, codes and standards to establish a clear timeline for improving the energy performance of buildings and equipment, and finally, utility planning and regulation, which can set mandates and frameworks to ensure utility investments and programs align with statewide building decarbonization goals. And today, what we're going to do is highlight 2 new policies in this space. Under codes and standards, the zero emission equipment standards, and under carbon reduction obligations, clean heat standards. And we want to highlight these policies because they're innovative and are right now, for the first time, being implemented in both states that will feature today, Massachusetts and Maryland. But it's important as we talk about these policies to remember that there is no one policy that will solve everything. We really think it is a suite, and states can pick and choose from at each leg what policies best suit their needs, but it's important to see policy change in these 4 key areas. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll finish off by just communicating or reiterating why we think a table is so important. And that's because this promotes cohesive, coordinated policies across state agencies. Right now, state agencies are working on different policies and different areas of regulation that all lead to building decarb, but we would like to see a coordinated approach where these regulations and policies align with one another and can feed into one another in order to help every regulated entity align on building decarbonization for the state. We also want to balance incentive-based and standard-based practices in the market so that there is both a driver to encourage change and a mandate to ensure change happens. We would like to work towards a seamless marketplace experience so that regulated entities like distributors, manufacturers, contractors, and customers are experiencing the same mandates and requirements as they from different agencies and from different policies. And finally, we think it's important to put all of these under one framework to track results and GHG impacts across programs. So there's accountability to ensure that we are achieving the climate goals and building decarbonization. And with that, I will invite Nancy Seidman from the Regulatory Assistance Project to talk about zero emission equipment standards.
Great. Thank you, Erin, so much. And thank you to NEEP for organizing this webinar. So good morning, everyone. I'm Nancy Seidman. I'm a senior advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And RAP is an independent global NGO advancing energy and environmental policy and innovation and thought leadership for a clean energy future. As Erin mentioned, I'm going to present on one leg of the table, codes and standards with a focus on zero emission equipment standards. Thanks to Emily Levin of NESCOM for her help with these slides. So as a former air regulator, I'm going to start with some background on the sources and impacts of building pollution. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of the sources of nitrogen oxides in the Northeast, and I'm going to talk about nitrogen oxides in a little bit. On the left, you see that transportation is by far the largest sector of emissions of nitrogen oxides, but buildings are significant and significantly more than power plants Buildings being right next to transportation and power plants being the small is circle in the middle. In the Northeast, nitrogen oxide emissions from buildings are about 1/3 that of transportation and more than 10 times that of power plants. On the right, we have a breakdown of nitrogen oxide emissions from on-site fossil fuel combustion from different home equipment. Space heating is responsible for approximately 80% of those emissions, and water heating is approximately 20%. Next slide, please. So this slide discusses the health impacts of building emissions. US EPA establishes criteria pollutants, that's a term of art, standards for 6 common air pollutants. 4 are important from building combustion: carbon monoxide, ground level ozone, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. NOx, as it notes on the left, reacts with sunlight and other chemicals in the air to form ozone, or summer smog, which is a powerful lung irritant, as well as NOx is a precursor to particulate matter. On the right, you see the various health impacts that are caused by air pollution, and there are many. The most harmful pollutants are the very fine particles, those smaller than 2.5 microns. For comparison, human hair is about 50 microns. And fine particles can be easily lodged in your lungs and can cause impacts such as premature mortality. Next slide, please. And as we know, air pollution doesn't affect everyone equally. RMI prepared this slide based on the article that's referenced at the bottom. The article analyzed national fine particle data from all sources of air pollution and found that people of color are disproportionately affected by air pollution, about twice as much exposure. RMI took the data used in the article and prepared this slide showing that combustion equipment is disproportionately harmful on its own. Note that the data is shown in percentage variance from average population exposure. This slide is based on national data, and RMI has done analysis of some individual states, which shows that the groups that are harmed the most, here shown as Asians, varies depending on urban and rural exposures to fine particles, but the general conclusion of twice as much exposure holds. In summary, on this slide, here's the evidence that backs up what we know intuitively, that air pollution harms everyone and harms people of color more than others. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn to what we're proposing that states can do to reduce the harm caused by building emissions using codes and standards. I'll start with that codes and standards are sticks, as shown on the left. And I think probably many of the folks on the webinar today work on programs that are the carrots to the right. Those are very important programs that also help reduce emissions. But on the left, we show the policies discussed in our table brief. All of those listed are discussed in the paper. But I'm going to focus on zero emission equipment standards. And Mark will talk briefly about building energy performance standards. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So this slide describes the zero emission equipment standard and how we approach the problem. In the middle, we note that some states have had nitrogen oxide standards for furnaces, boilers, and water heaters in place for decades. And now some of those jurisdictions, those in California in particular, have promulgated new rules requiring zero emission equipment, heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, for example. And based on those efforts, NESCOM and RAP have been working on low NOx and zero emission model rules for water heaters, small boilers, and furnaces. This model is intended for states to use to expand the requirements for this type of equipment and drive down building emissions. On the left, we note that the requirement will apply to new equipment the mechanism is to prohibit the sale of equipment not meeting the emission standards that would be established in the regulation. And on the right, we're encouraging state environmental agency to promulgate these rules using their authority to improve air quality and reduce climate change, since these rules can be incorporated into state plans for meeting EPA's public health standards for ozone, fine particles, or regional haze, as well as helping achieve climate goals. Next slide, please. To shift to, okay. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, okay, I'm missing a slide. That's all right. I was going to talk about the process that has been used. Maybe back up one, please. Thank you. Let me shift to process for a second. There's a slide that I can make sure goes out in the notes that describes how NESCOM has been convening the U.S. climate and with the U.S. Climate Alliance to assist states in advancing zero emission equipment rules. An announcement was made just about a year ago at Climate Week, which is occurring this week. And that announcement included a commitment to install 20 million heat pumps by 2030. And 10 states committed to explore the adoption of the zero emission equipment standards for space and water heating. Those states are California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Washington. And as I see now, Rihanna has put in the chat the next thing I wanted to mention, which is following this announcement at Climate Week in February, NESCOM helped states develop an MOU that was released with more detailed commitments on building electrification. And that MOU encompasses many aspects of the table we're talking about today. That MOU was signed by directors of environmental agencies, and it included some of the same folks as before: California, Colorado, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Rhode Island. Next slide, please. So let me summarize my presentation by talking about the benefits that we see of doing a model rule for zero emission equipment standards. And in the Q&A session, I hope to be able to give you some specifics on our timing and what that rule may look like. But to close out, I want to reiterate the importance of zero emission equipment standards, why we see them as an important tool for states. So we see benefits of creating a market signal for ensuring a transition to heat pumps. We see these rules as being feasible since zero emission heat pump technologies are available and perform well in cold climates. We see this tactic as effective because it tackles the major sources of pollution when equipment is turning over. It fills a gap in our regulatory framework because it addresses pollution from small buildings, and unlike codes, can apply to new and existing buildings. And last but not least, it's equitable and can be designed to be implemented equitably and affordably, particularly with the engagement of industry and stakeholders. Next slide, please. And with that, here's my contact information, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Richard Cowart, who's my colleague and a principal at the Regulatory Assistance Project. Thank you.
All right, good morning. This is Richard Cowart, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you an introduction to the Clean Heat Standard, which is an emerging policy initiative to drive decarbonization in the building sector. Next slide, please. What is the Clean Heat Standard? The basic concept of a Clean Heat Standard is that it is a performance standard which would require the heating providers, particularly fossil heating providers, to deliver a gradually increasing percentage of low-emission heating services to customers. And to think about this, we have, analogies and experience, across the country in a variety of performance standards, particularly renewable portfolio standards, but also energy efficiency obligations that work at the customer level that require an increasing annual delivery of either renewable electricity or energy efficiency in line with established state goals. One aspect of a clean heat standard as a performance standard is that it can, according to state decisions, choose to include a variety of resources, both installed measures like weatherization and heat pumps, and also low emission fuels. Obligated parties can be given a choice to deliver either installed measures or fuels, depending on state policy choices, to meet the obligation of a clean heat standard. Let's go to the next slide. So just to put this in graphic form, what we have is a pretty straightforward set of images here that clean heat standard is a state-specific rule that places an obligation on fossil fuel providers. And I guess I should note that the obligation could be placed potentially on electricity providers as well, to deliver clean heat services at the end use level. And so what's really important here when you think about building decarbonization is that things have to happen in buildings. Either different fuels have to be delivered, or different equipment has to be installed, or the building shell has to be improved. But things have to happen in a very distributed way in order to decarbonize the building sector. The clean heat standard is designed from the bottom up to ensure that delivery actually occurs. Next slide. The essential elements of the architecture of a clean heat standard have been thought through in some depth in Vermont through the Clean Heat Working Group and the legislation adopted in Vermont, and then subsequently in Massachusetts and in Maryland, and separately in Colorado. To answer these 8 questions, I'm not going to read them all, but I'll just touch on a couple. I mean, first of all, there is the question, what is the obligation and how do you measure the performance under the obligation? Importantly, how can we design the obligation in such a way as to promote energy justice and to ensure that everybody gets the benefit of cleaner heating services? And then the third major category of questions is what actions or fuels would be eligible to count as clean heat measures under a state's clean heat standard. And then question 8 here echoes what you've already heard, particularly from Aaron. How does the CHS mesh with other state policies to promote building decarbonization? And importantly, the CHS is designed to build on and incorporate and promote the actions that states are otherwise developing for building decarb. The idea is that these things can really work together. Next slide. What's the status of clean heat standards around the country? Colorado has adopted legislation that in their instance focuses on the large pipeline gas utilities only. And the PUC is now looking at the plans filed by some of the major companies. Vermont has adopted the Affordable Heat Act, and the PUC is now evaluating, developing a rule soon to be presented for public review. And it will go back to the legislature. Massachusetts, you will hear about in a few minutes, and Maryland, you will hear about in a few minutes, are also developing clean heat standard rules. And so there's action happening in those 4 states. Legislation has been introduced in a couple of other states, and under the Climate Alliance process that Nancy mentioned, at least 4 additional states have committed to explore a clean heat standard. And I'd also add that there's active interest from Minnesota. It's also useful to understand that other models of a clean heat standard are under development in Europe. France has already implemented one for pipeline gas companies. Next slide. I'll just close by answering the question, why do we need a clean heat standard? And I'm echoing some things that you've already heard from the other speakers. Fundamentally, we need a policy driver, not just a set of incentives, as the incentives alone have proven not to be enough to overcome the market barriers in the buildings sector. And it's useful to pause and to realize that there are millions of individual decision makers and individual buildings, individual actions that have to occur. And in order for the workforce to come into existence, to deliver this change, businesses need to have a predictable path. They need to know that there is going to be a performance obligation in place that is going to support the evolution of this market, much as the existence of a renewable portfolio standard has really been the backbone of the development of the clean heat or clean electric generation industries. Next, we can't load all the costs of the energy transition on electricity. If you just look across, who's bearing the burden of decarbonization in this country, the electric sector is supporting renewables, they're supporting energy efficiency obligations, and for the most part, the fossil sectors, which are in most places, the more polluting systems, are not bearing a fair share of the cost of transition in the buildings sector. Customers value choice. A CHS rule permits customers to choose how they're going to go, when they're going to go, but the obligation is not on the customer. The obligation is on the fossil heating providers in general. And of course, it supports companion policies. Credits can be given in a clean heat standard for the delivery of measures that are required or supported from other programs. And then I'll just close by saying that we know from the RPS and from efficiency obligations and from other sectors that performance standards can be a well-designed, implemented tool to deliver the savings that we know we need. And I think that's it. I think what we have next is a slide showing some of the resources that RAP and others can provide to you if you want to know more about a clean heat standard. Thanks. I think I can turn it back to Erin.
Yep. Thank you so much, Rid and Nancy, for the background. I'll just highlight for the audience that if you have any questions about the policies that we just went through, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. And with that, we'll now pivot to hearing from states about what is actually happening on the ground there. And for that, I will invite Emily Lamb from Massachusetts to come up.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Lamb from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Will Space, our Senior Technical Advisor for Climate Programs, also be joining later for the Q&A portion. But with that, we could go to the first slide. So Mass DEP has been tasked with developing a clean heat standard as a way to address emissions from the thermal sector in Massachusetts. For Massachusetts, our Global Warming Solutions Act has legally binding emissions limits and requirements that we need to meet. And the planning processes for the Clean Energy and Climate Plans, or CECPs, for 2025 and 2030 and 2050 all identified a clean heat standard as an effective policy tool that Mass DEP should develop to meet those, to address emissions from the thermal sector. A clean heat standard was also recommended from the final report of the Massachusetts Commission on Clean Heat. All of these directives came out towards the end of 2022. So with that, we could go on to the next slide, where I'll talk a little bit about the process where we've been. So you can see in 2021 and 2022, those are the reports that I just talked about that directed Mass DEP to develop a clean heat standard. So then in the spring of 2023, we launched an informal stakeholder process. We call it informal because it isn't part of an official rulemaking process, but we wanted to hear what stakeholders thought. We knew people had been thinking about this challenge for a long time. So we released a series of materials. I won't go through all of them, and then asked for rounds of feedback from stakeholders throughout the year. I do just want to highlight that in the fall, we released what we call the draft program framework. And this framework really laid out MassDEP's current thinking on some of the key policy design topics that Richard just described for what a clean heat standard could look like in Massachusetts. And I'll speak about that in more detail a little bit later on. But I want to go to the next slide to just talk a little bit more about our stakeholder process. So we held 2 different types of meetings throughout the stakeholder process, and this was based on feedback that we got from stakeholders. So we held a series of what we called virtual community meetings, and so these were every 4 to 6 weeks. Content was for a general audience. We usually held sessions sort of one during the day and one in the evening for the most part, and there was built-in time for questions and comments. And then simultaneously, we also held a series of technical sessions that really went into more depth on program design topics, were aimed at sort of a more technical audience. So we held those 2 sort of streams of meetings throughout our informal stakeholder process. And then on the next slide, talk about some of the materials. We also put a lot of materials up on our website. So we have all of the descriptions of the policy questions and considerations that I'll talk about in this session. And we also have some general background on what a clean heat standard is. We put up copies of all of the comments that we received throughout the process, as well as summaries of the themes in those comments. And we posted all of the slides and recordings of all of the stakeholder meetings. We also have an FAQ document that we updated throughout the process based on sort of the questions we were getting from stakeholders throughout. So there's quite a bit of information up on our website. With that, we can go to the next slide. So now I'll pivot a little bit and start to talk about what's actually in the draft program framework and the next steps for the rest of this year. So we can go to the next slide. This, Richard already explained what a clean heat standard is, so I won't spend much time here, but it would be a regulation that would require heating energy suppliers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over time. And the heating energy suppliers would demonstrate those emissions reductions by holding clean heat credits. And like I mentioned, we released a draft program framework in fall of 2023 that addressed key policy design questions. So these 4 topics highlighted on the right, setting the standard, so how much clean heat you need over time, the regulated heating energy suppliers, so which companies need to comply with the clean heat standard, credit generation, so what counts as clean heat and how you count it, and then finally some concepts for compliance, flexibility, and revenue, so things that will help the program really work. So now we can go to the next slide, and I'll talk through what's in the framework on each of those 4 topics. So first, for setting the standard, the draft framework included requirements starting in 2026 and going out all the way through 2050. And it included 2 separate requirements, one for full electrification projects, which would be met by installing heat pumps, and then one for emissions reductions credits, which would be met from operating clean heat using clean heat. The full electrification standard, I want to point out 2 things about it. One is there's a low income carve out included. So 25% of the heat pumps installed to meet that standard would need to be serving low income households. And then that full electrification standard would phase in gradually over time. So it would start at a level that's consistent with sort of the current pace of heat pump deployment in Massachusetts, and then increase over time to meet the emissions reductions goals of the state. Moving on to regulated heating energy suppliers, so which companies would need to comply. The framework included annual requirements for electricity, natural gas, heating oil, and propane suppliers. And the obligation on the electricity suppliers in the framework starts small, but then would increase over time as more and more customers are electrifying as we're installing more heat pumps. Next, I'll talk about credit generation, a topic of great interest. So the framework limited crediting to electrification and certain liquid biofuels at the program startup, and included a program review really early on in the program in 2028. that would revisit eligibility based on three main considerations. So the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, the local availability and supply, and then also other local air quality impacts of either production or consumption, or production or combustion of the fuel. And then for the full electrification standard, to meet that standard, the credits would be limited to residences that install electric heat pumps that are capable of meeting 100% of their space heating needs. So that's what we mean by full electrification in that standard. And finally, I'll just talk about some of the compliance, flexibility, and revenue mechanisms that were in the framework. So the framework included unlimited banking for the full electrification credits. It also includes an alternative compliance payment option, or ACP. So an ACP is common in other portfolio standard programs like renewable portfolio standards that Richard mentioned. It allows the regulated entities to make a payment instead of acquiring the credits themselves. And the framework specifically points out that revenue from those ACP payments would be dedicated towards future clean heat projects, and that revenue from the low-income carve-out, any ACP from that would particularly be used to supporting equitable outcomes. And then finally, the draft framework also included a concept of a just transition fee, which would be a charge on the initial sale or transfer of certain credits, and the revenue generated from that payment would be used to support equitable outcomes during the clean heat transition in Massachusetts. So with that, I can go to the next slide to talk a little bit about kind of what we've been doing this year. So after we put out the framework, we also had a few other documents out for informal stakeholder comment, a voluntary early registration program that detailed the sort of eligibility requirements for that full electrification standard. And we also put out a discussion document on crediting for non-residential buildings. I'll note that this included the potential to credit clean hydrogen and renewable natural gas in those buildings, as long as it hadn't been blended with fossil fuels. We also formally proposed heating fuel emissions reporting regulations earlier this year, and then we closed out our informal stakeholder process and have since been working on refining program design with the intention of finalizing the fuel supplier emissions reporting regulation this year, and also proposing the comprehensive clean heat standard regulations. So with that, I'll go to my last slide, which just has some contact information for us. And I think I'll pass it along to Mark to tell us about what's happening in Maryland.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Mark Stewart. I run the climate change program at the Maryland Department of the Environment. It is great being here with you. As I sometimes tell my team, we have the joy of focusing on the easiest part of solving the climate crisis and addressing climate change, which is developing policies to phase out fossil fuels in our economy. That is the easy part. Adapting to climate change is the hard part, as many of us have experienced with recent flooding events throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, as some of my family is experiencing today in Florida with what's expected to be a Category 3 hurricane making landfall later this afternoon. So lots of challenges with climate change, but happy to touch on some of the easier components, which is ending our long love affair with fossil fuels. Next slide. So Maryland has the most ambitious climate goals of any state in the nation. We have a legal obligation to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions 60% by 2031 and to achieve net zero emissions by 2045. Last December, we released our climate pollution reduction plan, which lays out 42 policies, some current and some new policies that work together to achieve those goals while creating a net economic benefit for the state, including creating 27,000 new jobs between now and 2031, growing the state's economy by $5.3 billion, and creating that other net economic benefits. You can find the full plan at our website, mde.maryland.gov. Next slide. Among those 42 policies include several policies that are focused on the building sector. Really what I want to highlight very briefly is that Maryland is working hard to implement many of the legs of the table that was presented earlier and published in the NEEP report, which we love, and we've been using that table in meetings since then. So thank you, NEEP, for putting that out there. Today, I want to touch very briefly on just the highlighted policies, but do want to point you to the fact that we've got a lot of policies in the works that touch on the many legs of the Building Decarbonization Table. So next slide. With building energy performance standards, something passed in Maryland in 2022 called the Climate Solutions Now Act that required MDE to develop building energy performance standards, and it established a goal that large buildings, those are buildings that are 35,000 square feet in size or larger, need to achieve zero net direct emissions by 2040. Net direct is a interesting term of art that our legislature created, but it essentially means the direct emissions from the buildings. We have incorporated some other kind of net components, such as if you're a building that's connected to a district energy system, the emissions associated with those district energy inputs to the building count toward the direct emissions of the building. So anyhow, without getting into the weeds, the requirement is essentially zero direct emissions from large buildings by 2040. We are also required by law to establish energy efficiency targets for the buildings in the form of energy use intensity targets. Right now, we're advancing a regulation that would establish reporting requirements that beginning in June of next year, buildings would have to report energy use data to MDE, and we're also this year establishing the emissions standards. We intend to establish the energy efficiency standards in a couple years from now, once we've collected some additional data. Next slide. The process for building owners is pretty straightforward. Beginning next year, they'll use Energy Store Portfolio Manager to track their energy use and their emissions and report that to MDE. They will also evaluate where they are compared with the standards. When it comes to the emission standards, what we see is that about a third of our buildings are already achieving or very close to achieving the zero standard by 2040. In other words, they're mostly all electric buildings already. Another third can make pretty minor improvements in order to achieve the 2040 standards. And then there's another third of buildings that use a significant amount of fossil fuel and will need to make some more significant investments to achieve the standards. They'll need to start achieving interim standards in 2030. If they don't achieve those standards, then any emissions above their target levels will be subject to an alternative compliance fee that is equal to the social cost of carbon as adopted by the US EPA. Next slide. So moving quickly to the some of the newer policies and the ones that were touched on in this webinar. In June of this year, Governor Moore issued an executive order requiring my agency to propose zero-emission heating equipment standards and clean heat standards in order to achieve our climate goals. So on one hand, Maryland's had a lot of success in reducing emissions. According to EPA data, we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions in our state faster than any other state in the nation. So we're building on a lot of success. But one of the things that we've been clear about and clear with the governor's office about is that new policies are needed in the building sector. Despite Maryland's success in reducing emissions, our fuel use within Maryland's building sector has remained flat for decades. I mean, it's really constant. So we know that some new policies are needed, and we were happy to have the support of the governor in calling for us through executive order to promulgate these two new regulatory programs. Next slide. So the team at RAP, who we work with closely on the development of a clean heat standard, and our colleagues at Mass DEP touched on this well, so I'm not going to reiterate all the good points that they've already made about the clean heat standard. I'll just say that our intent is to, in 2025, to adopt a reporting rule to require the obligated parties, the providers of fossil heating fuels, to begin reporting data to MDE so that we can establish their performance baseline, establish components of the program, and then later down the road, we would then integrate the performance requirements for the obligated parties. Next slide. And with zero emission heating equipment standard, again, great overview on that earlier. I'll just say that we do intend to adopt the model rule that's expected to be published this fall. We're looking forward to publishing it, to seeing NESCOM publish it, and then doing some stakeholder engagement on it. We're among a number of states that have committed to adopting zero emission heating equipment standards and adopting other policies to reduce emissions from the building sector. We intend to adopt a zero emission heating equipment standard in 2025. Next slide. And I'll say just very quickly on Empower. Empower Maryland is our long-standing and very successful energy efficiency program, historically requiring our electric utilities to implement efficiency and conservation practices that has driven down electricity consumption in Maryland's buildings. That has created headroom on our grid to facilitate and allow for more electrification in the near term without straining the grid. So it's been a really successful program. Recently, our General Assembly updated the program to require that that gas utilities also are obligated to participate, and that all utilities will have to achieve greenhouse gas reduction requirements targets within their empowered programs. Next year, starting in 2025, will be the first year when our utilities have to roll out their programs that are designed to achieve certain specific GHG reductions. Next slide. And that's it. That's my quick overview. Really happy to be here and happy to stick around for Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. And I'll invite all of the other presenters to please turn on your cameras. We've had a couple of questions in the chat that I think we'll try to touch on first, and then see how much time we have left to maybe go into more detail or take some questions. But yes, I'll take this moment real quick to just remember, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat now. And then also, again, like the slide right now is advertising our heating electrification workshop, which is coming up on November 19th. But we'll talk more and put a link in the chat about that after we're done. First, though, we did have a question specifically about what other choices do customers have for clean heat options when they do implement a clean heat standard. And since we have two states in the room with Richard, I was wondering if you could all kind of talk about what options you're presenting in your states, and then Richard, if you would like to add any other options that you've seen states use, especially Vermont isn't here, but I know they were coming up with their framework. Emily, can I toss it to you first to take that question?
Sure, yeah. So in Massachusetts, what is in our framework is heat pumps, air and ground source heat pumps, and then in addition, certain liquid biofuels. So our framework would allow for the counting of waste-based liquid biofuels, and then for some crop-based liquid biofuels through 2030.
Wondering, Mark, if you're able to add any insight for Maryland's process.
Yeah, I mean, we're still in the middle of our rulemaking, so it's a little early to say what exactly those measures are going to be. But we have we have given a lot of thought and started to share out that there's a lot of focus on the installation of zero emission heating equipment, of course, you know, and an important context, we intend to adopt zero emission heating equipment standards. So, you know, looking at a clean heat standard that really aligns and supports the zero emission heating equipment standard. But we also acknowledge that there's some limited path in the decarbonized economy for alternative fuels, especially for high temperature applications that could be covered in the building sector by the clean heat standard. So we do intend to have an alternative fuels pathway and use a robust model. Many of you are probably familiar with the GREET model to evaluate the life cycle emissions of alternative fuels.
So I guess I'll chime in and just refer people to the Affordable Heat Act as enacted in Vermont, which lists both installed measures, which include, by the way, building shell improvements and weatherization as creditable activities, and heat pumps, obviously, and also using the GREET model, or a model of similar rigor, analytical model of similar equivalent rigor. There would be some opportunities for alternative fuels to earn credits, but there's a provision in the statute that requires over time that alternative fuels are only permitted if they are increasingly clean in comparison to traditional fossil fuels. So there are a lot of nuances with respect to alternative fuels that will be, I'm sure, under discussion in all of these states. But there's a question in the chat about weatherization, and I want to emphasize that as designed, and I think this is the case in all the states, that weatherization measures would be creditable, and also weatherization measures, you know, are typically, or the weatherization assistance program really focuses on lower income housing, and so that would also qualify, importantly, in those programs that have a carve out for low income clean heat measures, they would qualify also as low income in many instances.
Great. Yes, thank you for bringing that question to the forefront, Richard. And Emily or Mark, if you wanted to add anything about how you're coordinating with weatherization assistance providers right now, that'd be great. But I understand you're both still working through.
Yeah, I guess I would just clarify, I think in Massachusetts, the framework doesn't include crediting for weatherization. It's not part of what we're talking about crediting at this point. You know, obviously no final decisions have been made, but so that's maybe a non-answer.
I'll say that we're working really closely with our Department of Housing and Community Development on both the zero emission heating equipment standard and the clean heat standard, thinking really carefully about the impact on low and moderate income households, the requirements within a clean heat standard to prioritize investments for the LMI community, and thinking about some of the additional resources that DHCD may need to amplify their existing electrification support programs. Like currently, for low-income households, they cover 100% of the cost of replacement heating and cooling systems. But of course, that's fund limited, and we anticipate that they may need more funding to be able to support the increased volume of electrification projects that we expect for low-income households.
Great.
If I could comment further, Aaron, that the question actually then alludes, to a somewhat thornier additional question, whether the rules for weatherization and LIHEAP could be written to actually require the installation of cleaner systems. And I don't know the answer to that question, whether those program designs can be changed in order to harmonize with the clean heat standard, I know the Clean Heat Standard would like to wrap around those programs and give support to them to do that. But whether they can do it inside their own program is a separate question.
Great. And I'll highlight, we're getting some specific questions about Massachusetts and electric distribution companies in the chat. And I see those, but I did want to take a quick second to pivot back to emission equipment standards, because I think that might bring the mandate aspect in that the question's talking about. And Nancy, if you wanted to, I have the model rule slide queued up, so you can talk a little bit about the process for that.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you, Erin. And I think Rihanna is going to also post an overview article that was given at ACEEE this summer. So if folks are interested in the background and how we got to this place. So this slide shows sort of the timeline that we're on for getting to model rules, as well as some background in terms of NESCOM's work with states, and reminding folks that this is going to be a model and states will be adopting and adapting it as they see fit. So focusing on the timeline down at the bottom, we're currently like right in the middle, that fourth bullet of the draft model rule for space heating, space and water heating. We expect to have the draft out before the end of October. In fact, we're planning a webinar for the end of October to sort of announce it to the world. There will be a lot of supporting material that goes with that, including a technical support document, some cost analyses. And so then that will be turned over to states, to like Maryland, who's anxiously awaiting it, we know, so they can proceed with their rulemaking process. So I think and again, we're providing this as a tool for states who see the need for additional reductions to help meet their goals.
Excellent. So we have probably time for just one more question. So I think I wanted to maybe give the states an opportunity to talk about how you're thinking about equity in the context of these policies, engagement as the policy is written, and then as the policy is actually implemented, what you're thinking to ensure equitable implementation. So Mark, Emily, or Will, if you'd like kick us off with an answer about how you're kind of viewing that and prioritizing LMI communities.
I already opened the door, so I'll just step through and then close it and pass it to Emily. Again, working with our DHCD to think about the impact on LMI for our programs has been really core in this, following the lead that was mentioned earlier for us on setting a specific requirement for clean heat measures to be installed in LMI, within the LMI community is really important for us. And meeting with EJ communities. So we had the pleasure and thanks to NESCOM for organizing this last summer of getting EJ members together to begin the conversation about the impact of these policies in their communities. We have a meeting coming up to revisit that same conversation and take it to the next level with EJ members. So that's just scratching the surface on some of our considerations.
Yeah, I think, also obviously really important to us in Massachusetts to make sure we're thinking about these issues, and it has been a big topic of our stakeholder process and thing that we've asked for a lot of feedback on. Our framework includes a couple mechanisms to support an equitable transition. So we have the low income carve out to make sure that heat pumps are making it to low income households and serving those customers. And we also have that carve out has a higher ACP rate, so you have to pay more for those ACPs if that's the option that people use to comply. And we would we've said we would dedicate the revenue from those ACPs towards supporting an equitable transition. And then I already described the just transition fee concept that we have, which again is all about making sure that we can implement this policy in an equitable manner.
Great, thank you all so much. That does take us to the hour. I will add also Vermont has a requirement that a certain amount of credits appear within communities, and they've created a technical advisory equity focus group as they design their program. So we're seeing states embed equity throughout these policies in all kinds of ways. But with that, I would like to thank our speakers so much for excellent presentations and all of this wonderful information for the attendees and for the webinar. So thank you all so much. And then I'll also close out by just letting everyone know that NEEP is having our heating electrification workshop on November 19th and 20th in Syracuse, New York, as you saw pop up. But we'll be talking about all things heating electrification, residential, commercial, and how to think about implementing all of these policies equitably at that workshop. And so with that, I will thank again all of the presenters and thank you all so much for attending. Really great webinar.
Thank you.